Software distribution, the new way. Applications. So if applications are the new way and they're terrifically exciting and they're really the way that you should really deploy pretty much all your applications, well then why did we save them until after talking about the old way? Well, if you can think of the complexities that are involved with doing things the old way, well, applications just kind of layer more options on top of those. So you kind of have to understand the old way of doing things because it is that understanding that kind of gets you in the mode or gets you in the mood for how we actually go about deploying applications. At the end of the day, the way that this whole applications delivery mechanism works is it's fairly much similar to how the old way works. There is a command line that needs to get executed on one or more computers out in the world, and this solution, config manager, goes about executing that command line. But where applications are different is in all of the workflow and the logic that surrounds when that command gets executed. In the old way, we dealt with packages and programs and advertisements. And so I would create an advertisement for a particular piece of software and I would deploy it out. I would typically align that deployment to the different machines that I need in a collection. But these days, that worked in the old days. Right? In the old days, we were more monolithic, and we would determine pieces of software that we would send to people. But these days, well, we're less concerned about the apps and really more concerned about the users. Right? The whole notion of computing today kind of follows the old iPad model. So users need apps, and when they need apps, they go and get the apps, and they do whatever they need, and eventually the apps just go away, or we update them, or whatever. So applications, this new application deployment model, adds a focus on users to the old way of doing things. And that's why you'll see I keep underlining can have and can be and can interact here. Because when you use applications, you can have multiple deployment types. You don't have to. You don't need to do all this extra effort. You don't need to have a Nokia SIS deployment and a Windows installer deployment and an AppV deployment, but you can have that now. You have more options. Your users can be more involved. So you can either push out that piece of software or you can make it available in this application catalog that a user can request. And also you can define request approvals in there. So when users want it, well, they click a button that says that they want that app, and then you click another button that says, okay, you're approved to have it. Config Manager also these days is much more aware of where, or can be made more aware, I guess is more appropriate, of which machines users tend to use. This was hard back in the old days. When I'm just pushing software out to computers, well, I had to kind of guess where the users were. I knew that the users that needed these apps were generally in this location, so I created a collection based off of that. Well, in 2012, we have this notion of user-to-device affinity. And user-to-device affinity is really my users have a series of devices that they just generally tend to use, and I can either via an automated solution or via the users asserting which devices that they use, create this mapping between users and devices. And so this new application deployment model can then pre-stage out all of the applications that that user might need onto the devices that they might actually connect to at some point. So it's kind of a neat little concept. Admittedly, in order to make use of this user-to-device affinity, there's some things you have to set up ahead of time. And there's just kind of a way, there's a change in the way that you go about thinking of applications. One of those changes has to do with the whole notion of a catalog. Okay, and in the Config Manager client, you're now going to see Software Center, which is, it's now a start menu item. Users click on it, it will show them the applications that are installed. The application catalog can also show them additional applications that are not necessarily defined for them. They're not mandatory for that machine, but they are available in case the user may need it. And the app catalog is something you actually have to install separately. There are, as we'll find out here in the interaction portion, 2 extra roles that we can assign into our site server, a app catalog website point and a web service point. So in this nugget, what we're doing is, again, we're taking this whole notion of deploying software. We're taking everything that we've already learned so far. We have packaged apps, we have virtualized apps, we have packages. We have, sequences that we've created for these apps. We've injected them into Config Manager, and well, now we're actually going to deploy them just using another layer of logic over the top. Okay, that's really what we're doing. And so in the interaction portion, we're going to create that application. We're also going to create or really just look at some of the detection methods associated with that application. If you think about it, so if I'm focusing on the user, and the user's moving around, maybe they're not fairly static in the devices that they use, and if I'm pushing applications based off of who this user is, well, not only do I have to know how to install the app, but I also have to know how to uninstall the app when that machine is no longer a machine that the user probably will be using. So there's more work that's involved here, not only to deal with the install side, but also the uninstall side. So that we have to kind of be aware of. And in fact, the challenge involved with doing installs and uninstalls may be what drives you kind of over the top towards doing more virtualized applications. We're going to create that application catalog website point, the web service point. We're going to deal with some of these client settings. You've seen them before, but I just kind of want to focus in on which ones relate specifically to application deployment. And then I'm going to give you a look at Software Center itself and the application catalog, so you can see how a user would interact with your config manager infrastructure. So these are kind of the things that we want to talk about here in this nugget. Really, as I said, we're building on what we already learned before. And in fact, just to prove that, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to open up the source files location where you see WinZip packaged and WinZip virtualized. Back a couple of nuggets ago, we packaged up WinZip. There's that MSI that's silenced already. If I just double click that, that'll install WinZip. I'm not going to do that. And then we also went and virtualized it, so I have this manifest down here, this XML file that will deploy the WinZip content, potentially in a streaming format, down to one or more users. So these are the two application types or deployment types that we've created so far for this application. So let's create the object that we think of as WinZip. Okay, the application here is WinZip. So what I'm doing here is creating first the application. And for the very first time that I'm creating an application, I'm also going to create an application deployment type. The very first one that I want to create is just the regular basic Windows installer, your native, setup.exe, run via an MSI location that I'm going to grab from that source files location. So here's WinZip package, there's the MSI. Bam. This is going to silently install, take care of getting WinZip deployed onto the local machine, change the configuration of that computer. Have to do actually a UNC path here, so a share path, config manager 1/source files. Remember a couple nuggets ago I told you, create that source files location because you're going to need it. Now, just because of the way that we packaged up that application, we're going to get a little error message here that says that the publisher of that application was not defined. We didn't actually put that in the MSI as we created it inside of that little tool we used. So this is okay. We're going to import this file anyway because we don't have we couldn't verify the publisher. There's no certificate information in there. That is pretty much it. So this is the application. And for this application, we're just going to call it WinZip packaged here. I can put some comments in here if I want. Here is the manufacturer information, software information, any reference information if I want. I can put in administrative categories in here. And what I'm going to do is essentially install this MSI here using MSI exec. That's all that I need. And I'm going to install this for the user. Now, in the packages and programs world, I would generally install it for the computer because in that world, I'm interested in getting stuff deployed out so that I can move on. But remember, this is intended to be a lot more dynamic in this world of applications, so I'm going to install this for the user in this case. When I'm done, well, this goes about creating the application and making it available for me here in this list of applications. Okay, so there we have it. We have an application. But what we really have is an application with one deployment type, right? That deployment type is the MSI kind of classic install type that we created. In fact, if I click over here on deployment types, I see, well, here's WinZip packaged, Windows installer, native. The technology is MSI. So this is just one way in which this application can be delivered to the users out in my environment. But I might want to have another way. Maybe I'd prefer for the application to go out via app V, so via some stream. And if for some reason the user just doesn't have the app V client for some reason, maybe they're not allowed to have it, maybe they just don't have it, maybe it's not working, well then the installed version is available as a secondary option. What I need to do is create another deployment type, which I would do by right-clicking on the application, choosing Create Deployment Type. So what this does is this associates a second deployment type with this application. And in this case, I'm going to choose an Microsoft Application Virtualization. I'm going to go find that here, back under Source Files, under WinZip Virtualized, connect up to that manifest, choose Next. And I've got to provide just, again, a little bit of information about this deployment type. So here's the app virtualization stuff. Again, comments, languages, these sorts of things. I've got some other slightly different options that I have to choose as well. If I am connected to the internet or within a fast network boundary, what do I want to do? In the streaming case, if you recall back when we were talking about streaming was I'm going to separate the package out into the stuff you need now and the stuff you're going to need later, and stream down to you the stuff you need earlier so that you can get the package up and running quickly. Or you can just download it and run it locally. In the case of streaming, well, it makes it easier when I'm, for example, deploying it to that application catalog. I might not know when the user needs it. So I don't want to make it downloaded and run locally because they might never actually click on the link. In this case, let's choose just download for now. How things look for the purposes of the user is essentially the same. Now, when they're within a slow or unreliable network boundary, do I want to do nothing, stream it, or download it? In fact, let's just choose stream for this because, if they're out in that slow boundary, I want to reduce, or I'd prefer to prioritize the data that gets sent down to the user so that they can get that application up and running as quickly as possible. I have to specify some installation requirements. And you'll notice here that Windows 7 x64 is the requirement type that I have here. I can also add some other requirements as well. Okay, for the device, for the user. Only a certain amount of physical memory in this case, or if they're in a specific site, or if they have a number of processors, or an operating system. The rule type here is set to value because I need to set essentially an operator, or Boolean operator, greater than, less than, whatever. When we talk about users down here, we can change the user conditions to, is this their primary device? I can add additional requirements if I want here under custom to create entirely new conditions. And these global conditions will identify based off of, well, any kind of setting. I mean, there's a very large list of settings in here that I can query off of for whether or not this user should be allowed to have this application via this deployment type. Do you have the right, WQL information? Is your WMI got the right information in it? IIS metabase, registry key, registry value. Do you fulfill the results of a script? You will find, and we'll talk a little bit later about compliance settings, that these are equal to, or exactly equal to, the different types of compliance settings that you can use in that function of Config Manager. So be kind of aware of how this works, because as we move into compliance settings, we're going to spend more time here with this whole notion of creating global conditions. Now, for now, I just don't want to do anything else. Okay, if you are a Windows 7 x64-bit computer, well, then you can run this application right on. Are there any software dependencies? We talked first about the endpoint, user or device. If you're the right user, you can have it. Are you the right device? Or you can have it. Well, is there another sequence that's required or another package that's required for you to actually get this package? I think I talked back in that packaging nugget about, those apps that just require like a Java runtime environment. Well, this might be a software dependency that must be installed before this deployment type can be installed. Choose Next, choose Next. And after just a second or two, that deployment type actually gets created. So you can see here that I have WinZip packaged, and for WinZip packaged, I have two different deployment types, the packaged and the virtualized. In fact, I probably should just call this WinZip up here. Now that I'm done, I need to actually distribute the content. I think you remember back on that last nugget, I told you the one thing you will consistently forget to do over and over and over and over again is to actually distribute that content. So what we need to do here is actually choose distribute content and then upload this content here to whatever distribution points are available. Here's my distribution point. There's the config manager 1, there's next, and that'll take care of in the background pushing out all those bits. Very cool. You know, we're really getting somewhere here. And in fact, if you really just kind of step through these things very slowly, all of these, what would otherwise seem complicated, actually kind of makes a lot of sense. But you have to pick apart why all this stuff, or how all this stuff interrelates. So, all right. So I have lots of these interrelations now. I can have some pretty, substantial package interdependencies, if you think about it, right? With different software pieces that are required, different hardware constraints that are required. Well, thankfully, Microsoft has actually made available this little view relationships node down here that will help you understand what the dependencies are for any particular application. You can see here, WinZip packaged contains, or WinZip packaged up here contains WinZip packaged and WinZip virtualized. So if you get confused or you need a map, well, this ends up becoming that very nice map for all the things you might need to have. All right, so we've got an application. We've got a couple of deployment types. I should mention that sometimes we might have a distribution point where, I don't know, my distribution point in Denver is fine, and I've got a pretty decent network connection over to Las Vegas, but I've got that other site up on Mars. And the network connection between here and Mars is just atrocious. But we've got a ship that's taking off here in the next week or so, and if I put a DVD or a tape drive or some sort of drive, some sort of very big USB drive these days, on that ship, well, it'll eventually get to Mars, and that's better than having to deal with the network latency between here and the next planet. Well, if that's the case, we also have the ability to, and where did it go? Up here at the top, to create a pre-staged content file. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but be aware that this pre-staged content file is the way in which you can package up the packages so that they can then be delivered to some remote distribution point somewhere else in the world. As you see here, use pre-staged content when you have low network bandwidth between the site server and the destination DP. We're talking about Mars here. And I don't need that. I've got my one single site here. I don't have to worry about DPs that are out in the world, so I'm not really creating much pre-staged content at this point. So, application. All right. What we next need to do is actually take a look at some of the properties of this application. You notice there's a bunch of tabs. On here provides just another location to adjust the properties of this application that we're working with. Again, comments, manufacturer, whatnot, when we published it. Do I want to allow it to be installed via an OS deployment task sequence instead of deploying manually? I'm going to skip over App Catalog here for just a minute because we'll talk about that here in just a second. Where are the applications that depend on this or that supersede this application? What are my distribution settings here? If I am using pre-staged content, am I going to manually copy that content or automatically download the content? Here under deployment types. Now, I got two different deployment types here, and as you can imagine, if I'm starting to push this thing out to different locations, and as my users are moving around in the world, they need WinZip, well, installing it via MSI in many ways is kind of hard, right? So I have to be able to install it via MSI, but I also have to be able to uninstall it via MSI too when that machine falls out of the scope of management for that user. So if I see here under MSI and choose Edit, I can see even more tabs that are associated with the deployment type. Now I want you to notice something here, and it's located here. So when I create this, I create an installation program, right? Run WinZip package.msi, but because I've packaged this up already, I also have an uninstall program that has to execute for when I need to get rid of that thing from all those machines. We didn't have this back in previous versions of Config Manager back in the SMS days because we really kind of just didn't care about applications, the uninstall portion. Once the app was deployed, well, we were kind of done with our job at that point. But now we actually have to worry about how to uninstall that program just as much as we have to worry about installing that program. So, or even updating and repairing it down here when we think about adding in the product code. So this process can be a little challenging. You know, the uninstallation for WinZip is probably relatively trivial, but there may be some apps out there that are a little harder to uninstall. So pay very careful attention to this if you start or if you intend to deploy applications via as applications, because you're going to have to know both the install and uninstall part of this. I also have to know how to detect whether or not the application actually exists on that computer or not. Now, back in the old days, we would look at it by, package ID. Right? I would know that a certain advertisement ID would have deployed a certain package ID out to that computer, and because of that, then I could use that information to identify where the app was located at. The hard part about that was back in those days, the only way that I could really do complete and total automated management was when every single application was deployed via Config Manager, because then I'd have the package ID on all those computers. Well, here in 2012, I have some rules that I can use to determine the presence of this deployment type. You'll see here MSA product code equals whatever. And I can add in additional clauses if I want. So certain files or folders exist in certain ways. Certain registry values or certain Windows installer values exist. And all this gets, as you can see here, all this gets relatively complex because I have to know when this application is actually installed so that when the rules change, well, I can get rid of it using the uninstall command. I can also use custom scripts. Okay, if I have some sort of PowerShell script or even VB script, I can use that to detect the presence of that deployment type. If I'm making this something that the user can do, right, do I want to adjust the experience settings for that user? Okay, do I want to install it for the user, the system or user? Do I want to make it available to the user? What's the maximum allowed runtime? How do I want to deal with applications that exit with different codes? Right, you see here the software might force a device restart, or Config Manager will force a restart. These are very, very important because, well, when the application knows that the application needs to do a restart to complete whatever it's doing, it's going to come out with an error code. And I need to make sure that that error code matches with whatever Config Manager assumes is going to happen. If that application attempts to do a restart and Config Manager isn't aware that that restart might happen, well, I might get a bad error code. So you might be saying, okay, well, what are those error codes? Well, now, it used to be a lot harder, but now I can actually plug in those error codes here to identify which codes correspond with which actions are being viewed or which behaviors are being viewed by Config Manager. Added more error codes, just change the values. Change requirements here too, operating system version, different device types. We already talked about what those requirements are before. And then also dependencies here. So I wanted to show you this whole concept for the packaged software, and particularly the detection method and the programs here, because over here on the AppV side, you'll notice that things get quite a bit simpler. Right? AppV is a virtualized application, and so for virtualized apps, the whole notion of removing them is, well, deleting them. So I don't really have to worry so much about how have they incorporated themselves into the system. How have they got their tendrils around those computers that they've been installed to? So for here, I've got the same kind of content here. How do I want to deliver the AppV manifest? How do I want the users to actually receive it? How do I want to publish it? Okay, if this has published items. What are the requirements for it? And then what are the dependencies for it? And everything else is just handled by virtue of the fact that this is a virtualized application. So as you can imagine, what I really want to do here is increase the priority on this AppV because it's just a simpler, it makes for a much simpler world. When I deploy this out, the primary or the highest priority deployment mechanism is AppV, and I will choose MSI, well, if I just can't figure it out, okay, or if my users don't want to use it. So these are really kind of what we want to talk about here. These are the content locations. This is the DP. Are there any supersedence issues? Is this superseded by anything else? And then lastly, who has the rights to do things here? But those are the items that correspond with the application that we've created. I told you when we started this nugget that everything that you've learned up until this point, we're just adding another layer or a couple of layers on the top of that, because it allows us greater flexibility in how we end up deploying things out. Now, we haven't at this point actually deployed anything. I've created the content. I've created all the metadata for it. I've created the different metadata associated with the deployment types, but there aren't actually any deployments down here. We have to actually deploy the package first. And the way that we go about deploying that package is down here under deploy. I should, just as an aside, note that there is a simulate deployment item here. And the simulate deployment item, I'm not going to spend much time with it, but the idea here is that when you are prepared with a package and you want to just see how your clients will respond based off of the characteristics and the constraints that you've applied, you can simulate the deployment so it won't actually deploy, but it'll just give you some nice reports, some responses about how that deployment will end up going. What we want to do is deploy. So in this case, what we're doing is we're deploying out this piece of software, WinZip packaged, out to a collection. And in this case, rather than a device collection, what I'm looking for here is a user collection. So let's go to all users. I'm going to deploy WinZip to the all users collection. I'm going to automatically distribute the content for dependencies. Not that I have any, but that's what the checkbox is there for, because you want those dependency content to be distributed as well. I have it on a DP. I can add an additional DP or even collections or DP groups here, or well, DPs or DP groups here. If I choose next, I can choose, okay, how do I want this software to be deployed? Install versus uninstall. Obviously, I'm installing. And available versus required. Now, I'm going to choose available here. In the old school way of doing things, we would generally choose required because we wanted to push out the software and be done with it. But in the new world, well, I want to make this software available so that the users could make use of it whenever they want. I can also choose to require administrator approval if the users request the application. So you've made it available. Phil over in accounting needs WinZip. He clicks on the link for WinZip and you get an alert, hey, Phil needs WinZip, is this okay? Well, that gives you a kind of a very rudimentary way to identify if the right people are getting access to the right stuff. And with the right roles in place, you could pass this out to your asset management people. Okay, we'll talk about roles and security a little bit later on, but you could pass that approval along so that somebody else could take care of that for you. Let's make this the approval required. Let's make it available. Let's make it available as soon as possible. We're not going to schedule it. So I can make it available beginning next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, whatever. I'm going to make it available right now. I'm going to display it in Software Center. Okay, I'm going to make it available to that client so they can see it inside of Software Center. I'm going to show all the notifications. I am going to not create any alerts. Okay, I could potentially, if the percent failure was above a certain amount, which is kind of nice. If I'm worried about Ops Manager kicking up, alerts, well, I can enable maintenance mode on systems where this ends up being deployed. And I'm done. Pretty easy. So now, I'm done. In the old school way, what this would do would begin creating the advertisement, and then the clients would eventually receive the advertisement. And if the advertisement were mandatory, well, then there would be a certain period of time when that advertisement would execute, and I'd have to monitor all the stuff going on in the background for users and when they would be getting that software. But this is different. Right? I'm not pushing software out. I'm just merely making software available to my users. So when I go over to my clients now, well, the whole ballgame changes. My clients aren't dependent on me to push things out. My clients recognize, you know what, I got to zip something up today. Maybe I should go get WinZip. So here in the client, I'm your average client person here. Let me go ahead and get rid of the clock over here. With that client there, they're used to going here into Control Panel and to Configuration Manager. Okay, and you've seen this before, right? So I got my components here, I got my actions here, I've got my site settings here, I've got some cache information and configs. So in addition to this configuration manager client, well, in the new world, there's also an additional client piece that we need to be aware of. That's here under all programs. Notice Microsoft System Center 2012 and this thing called Software Center. Now here under Software Center, I have, and again, this is what the client can see. I have a list of the installation status for any software that's available. I have any installed software that's out there. And then I also have this thing called options. Right? So Config Manager is pushing a lot of the control back down to the user to allow them to customize their own experience. You know, in the old days, you didn't want this. You wanted hard-edged, draconian control over all these settings because you needed to be able to push the software out. Well, we are just merely making the software available now. So as a consequence, there is now the ability, and all of this is optional, for you to allow your users to define when their business hours are. So 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. Gosh, I'd hate to be that user. And that ensures that any kind of reboots or any kind of weird things that you're doing are not going to happen during the period of time that they're actually working. So they can help you out. They can also define their power management stuff. Right? I don't want to apply the IT department's power management settings, and we'll talk about power management a little bit later, to this computer because I want it to be at, I don't know, low power, and I want my hard drive to spin down after 6 seconds of inactivity. I don't know. Under maintenance over here, I can choose to automatically install or uninstall required software, restart the computer only outside of those business hours. Okay? Protect myself from the IT department coming down and trying to do things. If I'm actually in the middle of a presentation, don't you wish you had this back in the old days? If I'm actually in the middle of a presentation, I'm in the middle of doing this very, very important PowerPoint slide deck to a huge customer, and you know what? Don't do anything while I'm in presentation mode. True story. This was back in the day. A company that I was working for was actively, in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation to a customer, huge billion-dollar contract, and oops, we pushed patches to that computer, pushed an update to that computer. Oopsie. And so as a consequence, the machine reboots right in the middle of the PowerPoint presentation. Very, very, very bad black eye for the IT department. Well, when I'm in presentation mode, you know what? Even the most important stuff is not that important that I want to give up my extremely important PowerPoint presentation. So this is really nice here too if you want to make that available for your users. The last one down here is remote control, which gives you the ability, or gives the users the ability, to either use the settings you define to them or adjust them. Okay, do you want view or remote access? Do you want remote control while you're away? Do you want, to play a sound? Those sorts of things. So these present the ability for the users to have a little bit more control over the experience that they get from you. And again, the old way of doing things had a lot to do with you're going to do what we tell you, darn it. Well, the new way of doing IT is a bit more in cooperation with our users than necessarily in competition with our users. Now at this point you might be wondering, okay, when's the application actually going to come down? I'm looking here at installation status, I'm hitting F5, I got no app, where's it at? Well, there are actually some rules that determine where an application ends up starting from. And the Software Center is really designed for installations that have already happened, right? There are some cases where you can make it available, where you'll be able to install stuff from here. But if you remember, what I did was I made the application available and required approval for it. So there's actually another place where the users need to go in order for this application to be found, and that is the application catalog. So you see find additional applications from the application catalog here. I can go search for it if I want. Now we haven't actually yet installed the application catalog bits to make this thing work. So the reason why we're not seeing anything here is because we have a little bit more work that needs to happen. Let's go back to our config manager server. Okay, we're taking a look here at config manager 1 once again, and I got my same application that I've created. I want to go down here under administration, and first let's take a look at the client settings. I know we keep coming back to this, but you got to make sure these things are correct for everything to work correctly. The first one here is under computer agent. We already talked a little bit about these deployment deadlines. Notice here that we can also, or we need also, to set a default application catalog website point. We don't have one yet. This is the next step. We've actually got to go and create that application catalog website point so that the users have access, or the client knows where to go to get those applications that have been made available. So let's create that now. Here under Servers and Site Systems, I've got my Config Manager 1 server, and I'm going to right-click and add Site System roles. Choose Next. The two roles I need are the Web Service Point and the Web Site Point. Choose Next. Here's the IIS website. Okay, do I want to use default website or something else? The web application name is CM Application Catalog SVC. I am not using certificates. I don't have a PKI infrastructure in place, so I'm just going to use HTTP. Choose Next again. Which site system server do I want to use for the website? What's the website and the application name? Keep an eye on this CM Application Catalog because you're going to need that here in just a second. And then for clients that are connecting in, okay, what's the NetBIOS name for client computers? And am I using, again, HTTP or HTTPS? Making things simple here with HTTP. Lastly is my ability to adjust the website point so that it's customized for my users. Okay, maybe I want to make my organization name CBT Nuggets. And my website theme, let's just leave it at blue. As you can imagine, I can think of some pretty garish color schemes here that I might use for that application catalog website point. Choose Next here and Next again to finish this process. Finally close. So in here in just a minute or so, it's going to go in the background just like it's done with the other role services and actually go about adding these role services to this Computer Config Manager 1. If I refresh this, this should show up now with 11 roles that are available here for the web service point and the website point. Not that much really to manipulate. Okay, just really what I just did just a minute ago. So I have those 2 points that are now available. I'm going to go back to client settings here, check the client settings, and take a look at computer agent. Now I can set that application catalog website point, either automatically detecting it or by using an Internet FQDN or the NetBIOS name. Okay, let's just use the Internet FQDN. Okay, I can choose any of these that I want. Click OK. Now when you're using that application catalog website point, the interaction that occurs between the computer and the website point requires a level of interaction that sometimes Internet Explorer doesn't really dig. So you'll notice the next one down here says, do you want to add the default app catalog website to the IE's trusted sites zone? Doing so will really make things easier for you because IE will automatically trust that application catalog's website. Couple other settings to set in here. Let's just change the Software Center, Nuggets, the Software Center organization name to match what we've got on the application catalog website. Install permissions. Do I care about users, primary administrators, all users? Where do I want to install stuff? Do I want to suspend BitLockers, the pin entry on restart? Can the agent extensions, so the file type extensions, manage the deployment of applications and software updates? This can be nice if your user gets a new docx file and you need to get another version of Windows or Microsoft Word, for example. Do I want to adjust the execution policy on those clients? If you're playing with PowerShell and you know that you need to set the execution policy to remote signed, or you want to open it up, well, doing so on all those machines can be challenging. This allows you to use your config manager infrastructure to adjust the execution policy for PowerShell scripts. And then lastly, do you want to show notifications for new deployments? Yes. So these are what you'll need to set in order to support delivering these applications through that application catalog website point. We're not done yet, though, because I want to bring in one more kind of topic. And specifically, let's see here, I don't think we have anything under, no, we don't have anything under software deployment, but we do have down here under user and device affinity. So I told you that when we're thinking about users, we kind of have to have that mapping between the users in the environment and generally where they kind of generally tend to be. Well, I can actually create that mapping via a number of different ways. There's a way I can do it via essentially ingesting a file in there. I can have my users define their primary devices. Okay, why don't you just tell me which machines you're generally running on? So I've got software already waiting for you. Or I can have Config Manager actually do a best guess estimate of where users tend to go. Now this is cool, right? Because users log in, and we now have, we have the ability for the success auditing entries for users. So I can monitor where users have logged in and the success auditing for those users. If I have enough of a database and I can crunch the data fast enough, well then I can define almost automatically, well, these users tend to log on to these devices generally. This is not a perfect science, but at least it provides some steps in here if my users forget to define their primary devices. These client settings I'm going to set because I want to show you how all this stuff works. So back here under Client 1, what I want to do is actually kind of speed up this process using the old actions trick here of just running through the cycle of all the different actions. And different people have different beliefs here. I just run through them all just because, well, I don't know, it's just fun. And I'm superstitious. Back in the old days, we had to run through all of these just in case. So if I run through all these actions, that tells Configuration Manager here on the client to go through its software inventory and its hardware inventory and to verify its policy, download all the policy stuff that it needs. And then after it's done, well, then that can change the whole interaction I have between myself or between this client and its server. If you haven't figured it out, I'm wasting time. I mentioned SMS stands for slow moving software, and sometimes, well, it just takes a while for that user policy and computer policy to come down to update even Software Center, even in the 2012 days. So, okay, so enough time has now been wasted. You can tell that actually we've gotten the new policy because the Software Center label here now says CBT Nuggets instead of Information Technology or IT Department or whatever it said before. We also know this because the Find Additional Application from the App Catalog link now works. So there's no applications here. Again, Software Center is it's there for the software that you've already approved. It's there for the software that's already on the system. It kind of deals with the stuff that's already there. If you want new stuff, you have to go to the application catalog. Now I'm going to log in here with my username and password. Notice that it actually specifically requests that username and password. And you can see that the application catalog, even though it's inside of Internet Explorer, kind of looks the same as what Software Center looked like. This is a Silverlight application. So if you're familiar with what Silverlight apps look like, well, this is one of them. You'll see here I have WinZip packaged, a version, some of this information isn't actually included in here, and that version actually requires approval. If I click down here on more details, and had I actually had populated this with more details, you would see some of these additional details associated with the application. This alerts the user that this WinZip instance is actually ready to go. In fact, you might actually, when you are deploying applications, want to make sure that you do a reasonably good job of helping people recognize, well, what the applications are and why they exist. If you recall, back when we were working with the properties of this application, I skipped over the application catalog tab here because, well, this is where you would actually go about entering in different categories for the user or populating a documentation file with information about how to use the application or some link text that would help people understand what that application is, even some keywords or some icons down here at the bottom. So this is useful because this information here for the application ends up populating what the user would see here. So I've got a user, right? The user's decided, you know what, I need to zip up something today, and so consequently what I need to do is actually request that application. When I click this link, it's going to create this request for approval. Well, why do I need the app? Well, I need the app just because. Good enough good enough reason as any, right? And then I can submit that request. So this process essentially adds an interrupt into the whole workflow, so that someone somewhere can say, yea, verily, this person is approved for using this application. The user here is going to show that their request has been submitted, and if they take a look at my application requests, well, they can see the latest status associated with those, or with that request. Now, you as the administrator are going to see those requests show up over here in your Config Manager console as an approval request. When they come in, you'll have the option to either approve or deny them. You know, Phil needs to zip today, so you know what? Let's go ahead and approve this request. You are approved. Have fun with zip. All right, choose OK. And now we've completed that interrupt in the process. So the users kind of have to be aware that you may have a step in this process if you're going to go through this administrator approval. Let me go ahead and review these application requests again. I refresh, and let's see. Oh, look, WinZip package has been approved. And oh, have fun with it. Yay, I can now make use of this application. So with this request in mind, I can now click to view the software details back here in the application catalog and choose to install the application. It asks me if I want to install the selected application. I choose yes. It goes through all the process of preparing the installation, evaluating the requirements, going through putting the icons in the right place. And then down here at the bottom, you can notice that we are going about the installation of this piece of software. Notice how there is an orchestration between the application website now and Software Center, so that if it's a very long package, maybe it's a gigabyte size package and it takes a period of time, the user has some visual notification that the software is actively doing something and they're not sitting waiting for some surprise to occur. Once that software installation is complete, you'll see that, well, here WinZip packaged here back in Software Center is an application that's been installed. And I can install other applications if I want, all the required ones for it, or I can uninstall the application if you want the users the ability to do that as well. Over here under installed software, well, here again is WinZip packaged. So this gives me the ability to deploy out this application based off of the users actually requesting. And as you can see, well, looky there, there's WinZip. And if I go here to WinZip and WinZip again, down here in the lower right, it's actually going to go through the process of bringing down that virtual application and making it available for use. And in fact, here we are, and we can use this application now at this point. So here is essentially the entire process from start to finish that's involved with getting these users access to these applications through this whole request process. Now, there's one more thing I have to tell you. And that's this third little item over here in the application website. So notice my devices here. And if you recall, we actually enabled users to identify which devices are actually theirs, their primary devices, so that I could create that linkage between users and computers. I already have Config Manager doing it back in the background, but I also want the users to identify, well, you know what, I regularly use this computer to do my work. So that allows me to, when I add the additional logic, to ensure the applications follow those users around wherever they may be inside of the organization. So this is really that whole process of doing application delivery. Pretty exciting, huh? I mean, if you think about it, when you go back to the old way of doing things, back in packages and programs, well, it almost seems really rudimentary compared to all the new features that you can encode into your new application delivery system. I mean, and you can have multiple deployment types. You can allow your users to be more involved with or without that request approval. You can create that user to device affinity to ensure applications are out and delivered wherever they need to be. And users can actually use that Software Center and Application Catalog so that they can manage their own applications that they need to do their job. You don't have to. You can push things down and using the old way, but you have the ability now to do all of that. So what are we talking about this nugget? We talked about all of that. We configured that application and detection methods. We deployed the catalog website point and web service point. We configured clients and user device affinity. And we also went through working with Software Center and the application catalog. So you now know everything you need to know to do software distribution the new way. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.